Hi, everyone. Welcome to All Things Creative. I'm Linda Riesenberg-Fissler. I'm your host for today's show, and I'm really, really excited. I have Andrew, and Andrew, I forgot to ask you to pronounce your last name for me so that I would get
It's
it right.
it's Allemann, Andrew
Oliver.
Allemann.
Okay, so I was going to say, but you never get, you can never be sure. So
Sure.
what we're going to be talking about is podcasting on this show, and Andrew is the founder of podcastguests.com. It's a service that connects podcasters with experts that want to be guests on your podcasts, or it's also like a great networking site that you can start talking with other podcasters and other people who would like to be experts, if you will, if that would like to be on your show. So it's a great way to link up with folks. And I am also a member of podcast.com. I'm out on the directory, and we'll see how that progresses through the years. This is a relatively new, I guess, job, we could call it, right? For Andrew. So welcome to the show, Andrew. Looking forward to talking about podcasting with you.
Thank you, Linda. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, so we're going to jump right in and do the first question. We talked a little bit about this before we came on the air. We want to explore podcasting, and I want you to talk a little bit about what are some of the essentials for podcasting? What do people
hmm
need to do? Because I think people think this is a bigger step than it is to do something
Right,
like this.
right. So, the great thing here is since we're talking about this on a podcast, everyone who's listening knows what a podcast is and they like them. So that's kind of the first step to get past. Podcasting, I think of it as voice blogging. And there's a little bit more to it than just blogging, right? I mean, you can go to
Mhm.
WordPress.com and you can be blogging 5 minutes from now, sharing posts on social media and that sort of thing.
Right.
And so this is more work than that. But yes, it doesn't have to be all consuming and something you have to spend hours and hours on a week just to produce. So if you've ever blogged before and you're thinking, hey, how can I add a new medium? How can I reach people at a different time, maybe on their commute to work, maybe when they're working out or out for a run. And podcasting's a great thing to do. And as you mentioned, you can make it as easy or as hard as you want to, really. I know a lot of people who make podcasting very hard. I make it harder on myself than it needs to be, but it can be very simple. Before I started my podcast, the Domain Name Wire podcast, I went out and hired someone to do like a voiceover intro, and I, spent money trying to line all these things up, get my podcast studio and sound just right. Whereas my wife, whose podcast gets 20 times as many downloads as mine, actually 40 times. She started with a $40 microphone in our closet because clothes absorb echoes and it sounds great. And
Right.
so that's how she started. She didn't overthink it, and hers is much more successful than mine. So it's one of those things you can jump into, and if you're not sure that you really want to do it, a great thing to do is to be a guest on a podcast. Like, for example, if you have an interesting topic you can talk to Linda about, being a guest on her show, it kind of helps you understand, hey, what's involved? Okay, I'm plugging in a microphone, I'm talking on my computer, through my computer, whether it's Skype, GoToMeeting, something like that. And you can kind of get the hang of it and see what you think about it. See if it's something that you can commit to doing.
Yeah, and it was really kind of interesting because when I started this, I started out over on Blog Talk Radio.
hmm
And I started talking to just artists, fine art artists, because I'm an artist as well as an author. And it was kind of interesting. The reception, like when I would approach other artists, like, come and be on the podcast, and, I'd hear, oh, I'm not good at talking in front of people. And it's like, you're not talking in front of people, you're talking to me, you know? So,
Right,
so,
right.
that took some of the fear away automatically. But yeah, so I mean, I started out over there just with using, I didn't even have a headset. I mean, I just talked into my computer mic.
Mm.
I'm not going to say how great the quality was, but you learn as you
Right,
go along.
right.
And, we got the headset and then the microphone. And I use GoToMeeting, which is a really easy way to get involved. And you can do great little PowerPoints like we're doing here. And um, if you put a lot of effort in up front, I probably could have had like bullet points and things like that if I had time to talk to Andrew about this. But I mean, so you can make it as as difficult as you want, or as easy as you want. And I
Sure,
think,
sure.
yeah,
I can tell you what I do at this point. And
sure.
so my podcast, let's see, today I'm recording episode 173. It's about weekly, so a little over 3 years. So I have, this is probably $100 microphone and a microphone stand. So that's maybe $200. And then I have a PC, so I record calls over Skype. So the Skype call is free. I have some free software called MP3 Skype Recorder. And then my biggest expense is I decided that I want to have my podcast edited, but I don't want to spend the time doing the work. And so I have a third-party editor. Right. And even that's fairly affordable. I pay $200 and something a month for a weekly show. And I literally say, okay, here are the files. Here's the name of the show, description for the week, and they edit it, they upload it to my hosting service, and it's that's it, right? And then hosting, which podcast hosting is extremely inexpensive. There are probably free services out there, but you can get an account for $5 or $10 a month. So,
right.
So the only necessary things there are podcast hosting, and a microphone, which, as you mentioned, you could just start out by speaking without a microphone, but you can get a great microphone these days for $40, right? Okay. So $40 one time, $10 a month, and you can get going. And then as your podcast takes off, you can always upgrade your equipment. You can outsource editing if you want to do that, and kind of grow it from there.
Right. Yeah. So if you're thinking about doing it, I think our advice is just go for it, have some fun with it, and don't be all comparing yourself to everybody else that's out there.
Don't overthink it.
Yeah, don't overthink it. Don't compare yourself. Just have fun with it, because I think the networking that comes from podcasting is where I think the gold nugget is. You get to meet all these people and talk to a number of different people, and you
absolutely
get to build on each other's creativity, and it just keeps it just gets better from there. So
it does. You're right.
Yeah. So we're going to jump to the next question. This is for people who are already podcasting. Tell us some benefits of having guests on your podcast, because a lot of the podcasts that are out there do have guests, but there are some that are just maybe one or two people having a conversation back and forth. So there's benefits to both of that, but so let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so there are a lot of benefits to having guests, and I found most podcasts I listen to have kind of a guest format, so for mine and my wife's, actually, we start out with kind of a news segment, because ours are kind of topical news, and then we go into a guest segment, and the guest segment is a big part of that. And I'll say sometimes I've had a guest drop out on me at the last minute, and I've been like, well, I still have to do my podcast, so I come up with a lot of stuff to talk about it. And the hardest part is, have you ever talked for 30 minutes just by yourself and record it? It's a lot of work. And so it's nice to have someone on the other side who's doing at least half of the talking. And if you're interviewing them, they're probably doing more. So, but the biggest benefit here to having guests on your podcast is that they'll help promote your show, one, and two, you're getting to talk and network with someone that you might not otherwise be able to. So if I call up, I have the CEOs of publicly traded companies on my podcast. And if I call them up and just say, hey, can I have 30 minutes of your time to talk about the industry? They're really like, I'm really busy. If I say, hey, will you be a guest on my podcast and talk to the industry here, and I'll give you 30 minutes, suddenly I'm doing a favor to them rather than them doing a favor to me, right? So it's an excellent way. And I know if you're an artist or a creative, I'm not from that industry, but I can speak from mine, which is, it potentially is someone that you want to partner with in the future, or you want to have as a client, or might be a customer, or someone you do something with. And this is a great way to get kind of that introduction, make it like you're doing something for them, which you probably are, but they're also doing a huge favor for you coming on to the show and being a guest. So, and then the first thing I mentioned there is that they help promote your show. So one of the things about podcasts is that, compared to, say, a blog post that thousands of people might see within a day, very few podcasts get a lot of downloads. The median number of downloads on a podcast per episode is fewer than 200.
Oh,
That's
wow.
in a
Really?
so that's in a
That was the
presentation.
2000s. I feel really good now.
You should. There's a presentation that Rob Walsh over at Libsyn, which is I believe the biggest podcasting host, put together, and it talks about the median, which a couple of years ago I think it was in the 200s. Now it's close to 200, and he shows you what percentiles you're in, and it's. I mean, 2000 is, yeah, you're in a much higher. Maybe I can find it while we're chatting here, but I'm going to say probably top 10, 20% of all podcasts. And so, yeah, it's not huge numbers, but you're talking about a very dedicated audience and one that has a lot of attention to what you're saying and is listening to a long form. And so, but my original point there, as I looked this up in the background, is that um, your guest, if you have a good guest on there who can help promote your show. For example, I'll promote the show in my newsletter that goes out to 3,500 people that are all into podcasting. That can help you get more downloads. And so that is very helpful, having guests on the show as well that will promote it. So
Wow.
I'm looking right now at Rob's presentation, and this one's from April of 2016. You are in the top 20%. So at the time, this is May of 2016. It took 1,400 downloads per episode to be in the top 20% and 3,900 to be in the top 10%.
Wow, that's
Um,
amazing. And here I
yeah.
was
So
complaining. So now I'm going to stop
yeah,
complaining.
yeah, you are doing quite well, and you have a great audience. Certainly to have over 2,000 is a fantastic audience. And when you think about podcasting, uh, when I went to one of the podcast conferences a couple of years ago, there was a very popular podcaster up there. He probably gets 50, 100,000 plus downloads per episode. And someone came up to him and said, "Yeah, I'm thinking about quitting. I just can't. I've only got a couple hundred downloads per episode, and downloads are people that download it onto their phone to listen to."
Hmm.
And the person, Pat Flynn, very famous, so I'm probably undercounting him by saying 100,000 downloads per episode, but he said, "Now wait a minute. If you could stand in front of a room and talk to 200 people a week, would that get you excited?" He said, "Oh, absolutely." And he said, "Well, then why are you disappointed about only having a couple hundred subscribers to your podcast?" And I think that was a great way of putting it,
Oh,
which
yeah.
is, think right now, think if we're sitting here having a fireside chat at a conference in front of 2,000 people, that'd be a great audience.
Yep.
And so when you think about what it is, I think that's exciting. But my main point there with having guests on the show is that if they can promote you to their newsletter, their social media channels, that can really help you get a lot more downloads to your podcast. And hopefully those people will keep downloading and coming back.
Right. Yeah, I'm doing a little bit of an experiment. I haven't actually sent a newsletter out in a while because I've actually changed the format of the show from being just artists to being people who are creative, creative entrepreneurs,
Hmm.
creative marketers, things like, because I really believe that there are a lot of interesting processes and thought processes and just, things that are folks are doing outside of just the artistic world that we could bring into that. So I'm trying to like reach out and bring those folks into the same um,
Hmm.
group of folks that listen to my podcast while I bring them new ideas and new ways of thinking of things. So maybe something that they heard a business marketer say will click with them to market their art a bit differently. So,
Right, right. That's a great idea.
yeah, so
Yeah.
that's why I renamed it All Things Creative. And like the previous week, I had a movie producer on, and I was talking with Dick Atkins, who was the producer, and we got to the end of the show, and I said, it's really kind of interesting. If I think of myself as a producer, as a movie producer, or an artist producer, I have to do everything that the movie producer does. I have to look at my budget. I have to make sure that I show up every day and things are in place that help me get things done. So I mean, it was just really interesting when you just start stripping away all of the onion
Hmm.
peels and you find out that the process is very, very similar. And I know that you had asked in an email to me, do I need to do something special to talk to your audience? And I'm like, no, we're the same people as everybody else. But I think the fine line that I walk is that I worked in a non, if you want to call it a non-creative business. I worked at a Fortune 500 company, Procter and Gamble, for 26
Mm,
years. So I have the ability to live in both worlds. So
right.
I kind of use my podcast as a way to bring those both worlds together. So
Excellent.
yeah,
Excellent.
so we have a fun time with it. So, and I guess and like you had talked a little bit about networking and the benefits of having guests on your show provide the networking, and I just want to reinforce that that is so true. When I first started doing the podcast, and I was interviewing um, artists, fine art master artists, if you will, people who are known internationally and nationally for art, and they were kind enough to come on the show. But I have this special relationship with everybody who has been on my show. I mean, I could drop them a note tomorrow and
Hmm.
email or
Hmm.
give them a call and just say, "Hey, I noticed that you're doing this with your painting. Let's talk about that process. You want to come on the show?" Sure, and it's
Yeah.
like I see them at conferences and different things like that, and we're hugging and having a great time. It's a building. It's more than a network. It's more a building of friendship. I mean, it's that type of relationship because the conversations get so, I don't want to say real
I, you
intimate,
know,
but it's just a one-on-one thing.
I can give you a great example from my industry. Now, uh, people who are in the creative community are probably rolling their eyes that, I'm in the domain name industry. I've been blogging about domain names for over a decade. And, but, there's one guy, and so at conferences and stuff in the domain name business, everyone knows me. They come up, they say hello. There's one guy that came into the industry. Oh man, time flies, but maybe it was six years ago, and he didn't know anyone. He didn't know anything about it, frankly. He'd done a little bit of research, but he said, I'm going to start a show where all I do is interview the best people in this industry, and going to have them on the show. I'm going to learn from them. My audience will learn from them. And so he started, I think I might have been his first interview actually, but then he kept moving up and up and getting great people to interview. And, really within 6 to 12 months, when he went back to that conference the next year, everyone knew him, right? And
Right.
and everyone was talking to him, and it helped him grow his business outside of what he was doing there. He was getting advertisers and stuff for his show, but he became someone who was very successful in the domain name business, and smart guy, ambitious, but really it came down to this idea he had is, hey, I'm going to go out and interview all these top people. They're going to get to know me and I'm going to learn from them. So
Right.
I think that's an example that drives home your point.
Right, exactly. Very, very good. So happens in both industries, whether you're a creative or a non-creative. It's the way to go.
Right.
So now we probably, hopefully, have encouraged our listening audience to be out there and start guesting. So let's talk about how you pitch yourself, because if you're
Right.
not if you're not very interesting, you're not going to get very far in talking on one of
Yeah.
the shows. So
Yeah. And we started by talking about the work you have to do to be a podcaster. I'll say to be a guest, although there's some work involved, there's very little technical stuff you have to do, and it's easy. So it's a great way to get started, as I mentioned, and see if you like it, and then you can flip the table and be the actual podcaster rather
right,
than the guest. So, I will say, because I'm not sure, and I'm trying to remember if we talk about this later, but let's be sure to talk about how to prepare before you are a guest on the show. Let's just
yeah,
make sure we don't forget that. I think it might be in your notes here, but so pitching yourself to be on a show. So let's say you came up to Linda and said, "Hey, I want to be on your show. I'm an entrepreneur." All right, let's just grab someone. Well, okay, what does Linda know from that? Not much. Okay, what kind of entrepreneur are you? Did you just start? Maybe you just got laid off your job and you're starting a business this week. That might make you a decent guest, but we don't know what kind of experience you have. You don't have any credibility at that point. We don't know if you've been on other podcasts. We don't know if you have other media appearances. We don't know if you can hold a conversation, right?
right,
And so there's very little there that that Linda can tell from your pitch. And so the key to a good pitch, and this is actually something I'm putting together for my newsletter for next week, it doesn't have to do with how long it is. In fact, concise is sometimes better. Podcasters don't have all the time in the world to read your entire story. but is to understand how you can help their audience. Tell that podcaster specifically, I can teach your audience this, or I have this experience that'll be relevant to your audience, and make it specific, right? So if an entrepreneur comes to Linda and says, I want to be on your show, I helped grow a business from 2 clients to 100 clients, and the company sold it. And this relates to someone in a creative business because, right? So this is how this is interesting to your audience. That's kind of the key when you're pitching yourself. And then, of course, you want to have the social proof in there, which helps if you've been on other podcasts. But obviously, if you haven't, you have to go with something else, like I spoke at a conference, or I'm a blogger and I have an audience that way. But kind of build some credibility there. Ideally, you can say, I've been on these 5 podcasts, maybe even link to them so that Linda can hear you, right? Can you actually hold a conversation? And then what can you do for that podcaster? How can you help them grow their audience by promoting the show that you're on? And you don't have to be a big name to be able to help someone out here. So I've talked to podcasters that landed big guest, huge whale. That person comes on the show, and then their downloads for that episode hardly budged at all because the person didn't help promote it, because they're on podcasts all the time and they just didn't care. As opposed to someone who might not have a huge audience, maybe on Twitter they only have a few hundred followers, or on whatever their favorite social media channel is, but those people really, really like that person, and that person does more than just says, hey, I was on this podcast, check it out. They actually promote it. And so pitch yourself both as a valuable resource to the podcaster's audience, as well as a valuable resource to that specific podcaster.
Great advice. So with that in mind, then, how should you pitch your show to a potential guest? Me going out and talking to other podcasters is, relatively easy. I know, I know what I can bring to the table, like you were just describing. But if I have a show that I want to pitch, it gets a little more dicey, because it's like I've never heard of this person, because there's a lot of that. There's a lot of podcasts out there. So how do you make yourself attractive to have them come on your show?
Yeah. Let me answer that, but it reminded me one quick thing too, is you want to make the podcaster's life as easy as possible. So coming up on that pitch as well, if you say, hey, here are 10 questions you can ask me, that I'll be prepared to answer. And that's something that actually you had for this show, Linda, because on podcastguest.com, we also have a directory where as a guest, you can create a one-page profile, and you can answer all these questions that make you stand out to other podcasters. So wanted to interject that quickly before I forgot.
And we're going to get to podcastguest.com, and we're going to go back and talk about that process of how you make it for that.
Perfect. Okay, so your question was, as a podcaster, how can you pitch yourself to guests? And this is one of those things that can be a little bit tricky, as you mentioned. And so when I started my podcast about domain names, I first tapped my Rolodex, right? So I went out to people in the industry that I knew, that I had relationships with, and pitched them. And they're like, sure, they'll do it. Worst case, they're doing a favor to me. Best case, they get lots of great exposure for themselves to grow their expertise, their products, their company's products, that sort of thing. But you really want to bring up what your audience is, the benefits that they're going to get from being a guest on your podcast. And so let's talk through what a few of those can be that you can promote to them. So let's say it's can we use me for this case, right? So
absolutely. Yes.
Why did I want to come on your show, right? So look, I don't have much of a creative background. I don't have a huge interest. I love the arts, right? But it's not something I think about every day. So why would I want to come on your show? Well, I have a service that we'll talk about in a little bit that helps connect podcasters with guests. And so by coming on this show, one, I get to evangelize about podcasting, which is something I'm passionate about.
Right.
But also, hopefully some of the people listening to this either get into podcasting and look for guests at some point down the road, or they say, hey, I'd love to be a guest on podcast. I'll sign up for this service and start submitting myself so I can be a guest on podcast. And so hopefully there's some commercial benefit for me down the road, but at the same time, I get to talk about something I love, right? Podcasting. So as a podcaster, when you think about it, when you're saying, hey, Andrew, will you come on my show? There are a couple things that you can offer. Hey, I've got this audience. You can talk about your audience size. You can say thousands of people download the episodes per week.
Mm-hmm.
You can talk about your social media following and all these people that will hear it. Newsletter, if you have it. If you have a blog, talk about that as well. Really, it's kind of an exposure thing, convincing the person that they'll get exposure, but also tapping into that kind of innate part of everyone. Everyone loves to talk about themselves or what they do, right? So
Right.
everyone in the creative, in artist, they're either passionate about talking about what they've done or they're passionate about art and making sure that as many people as possible appreciate art and what goes into it. So if you can tap into those two things, you'd be surprised at who will say, yes, I'd love to come on your show.
Mm-hmm.
And it's easy to ask people too. The worst thing that happens is they say no, right?
Yeah.
The best thing that happens is they come on and they have this conversation with you, and we've talked about all these benefits of having a guest on your podcast.
Right.
So that's how I would pitch it to people. And you'd be surprised. Most people, if you don't get many downloads to your podcast, don't even mention it. I don't think I've ever had anyone ask me how many downloads per episode I get until maybe afterward. They're like, hey, so, how many people are going to hear this right after we've recorded the podcast? And so I wouldn't worry too much about that. And if it's a highlight for you, if you have a big audience there, by all means, use that. If you don't, just talk about the other benefits that guest is going to get by being on your podcast.
But it's really kind of interesting because, like I said, I would have figured that 2,000 was probably average, just because I didn't have that figure that you gave earlier in the podcast in our show here. And now I've used that a couple times where I've said, well, I have an audience of, when we talk to podcast.com, we can talk about where I specifically say that. But, when I'm trying to get on other people's podcasts, I'll put that in there. It's like, I got a following of, 2,000 on my podcast, and I'll be happy to download this show and put it in my stream as well, and things like this. And I'm wondering if people are thinking I'm making that number up because
well, it's funny because I originally on my newsletter, when I featured podcasts, I'd say how many downloads per episode they had. But then I figured out there was no way to validate it, and people could say, "Oh, I get 50,000," and then there I am publishing it as fact, and
right.
People might be more excited. So
yes, I really I haven't really put that in very many of my requests lately.
Sure, and again, you might not need to. At the same time, if someone got asked to speak at a conference in front of 2,000 people that'd be interested in what they had to say,
right,
you'd say, heck yeah. So where do I sign up?
Exactly.
And so, I think you need to put it in that perspective as opposed to thinking about traffic to a website, which is going to be much larger, right? My website gets 75,000 to 100,000 page views a month. My podcast gets downloaded 6,000-7,000 times a month, right? So mine's even smaller than yours. But if you look at it, the perspective there of what you're actually getting, a 30-minute, 60-minute conversation as opposed to a couple quotes in a blog post or something like that, I think it puts it in good perspective.
Right, and the interesting thing is if I have an artist on All Things Creative, I naturally get a heck of a lot more downloads because the majority of my audience is artists. But at the same token, I'm still hitting that 200, 300, 400 number of downloads for people who aren't artists on my show. So, I've got a pretty mixed bag of people out there that are following me, and very thankful. So thank you very much, people who are listening. But it's I guess a more frustrating part of that is I know I have this diversity, but and a lot of times don't know who these people are. And I may never know who these people are. And we had a bit of a conversation of that with my movie producer friend. last week when we were talking, and it was like, you know what, you're not alone, because in the big companies that like Sony and all these, they're sitting in a conference room going, who are these people and how do we get to them? So it doesn't
Mm-hmm.
matter where you are on that food chain, if you want to call it that. It's just a matter of getting yourself out there, and people will find you. And that's kind of always that leap of faith that we always take.
Right.
And,
Right.
and and it's a leap of faith when you're trying to put yourself out there as a guest, or when you're trying to put your show out there to get guests to come to that show so that you can do the interviews. And it was just, I can still remember how excited I was when I got a couple really big name artists to come on. At that time, we called it Art Chat, to come on to Art Chat. And I just, after they said yes, and I hang up the phone from talking to them, because I would send them an email first, and I said, let's talk about it. And they would call me if they were interested. And I remember hanging up the phone the first time and jumping up down, going the old Meg Ryan, yes, 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 thing. And it was just, so there is a lot of excitement and fun in doing this. So if you approach it, as without any passion, and it becomes more or less a job, it's not as much fun. But
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
if you can make it fun, it's just all that fun comes through, all that passion comes through, and it's just, people enjoy listening to you talk and be excited. So
Right. Right.
so let's take a little sidestep here and tell us about podcastguests.com. And I know why you started it, because I know how hard it is to get guests. But I'm sure there's a number of people out there who don't really understand that process. So talk about how you decided to come up with
Mm-hmm.
guests.com.
So as I mentioned earlier, I've been podcasting now for a few years, and the first year, again, as I mentioned earlier, I was really just tapping my Rolodex, right? And so I had a guest every week. In a year, that's 52 guests. And after a year, I said, wow, I have two issues. One, my Rolodex is running a little bit dry here. And two, if I'm going to ever expand my audience, I need to find people that I wouldn't think of, right, to be
Right.
guests on the show. And so I said, well, how can I find these people? And I couldn't really find anything out there. There are a couple services that you can pay hundreds of dollars a month, and they'll book 4 guests for you, or help you get booked on other podcasts, which is okay, I guess, if you want to spend that kind of money. But there was nothing simple and easy to connect podcasters with guests. So I said, hey, okay, if there's nothing out there, this is a pain point for me. It's got to be a pain point for other people. Why don't I create the service? So I started podcastguests.com as a service to do exactly that. Help people like you and me that are looking for guests for a podcast cast a wide net and find good people. And likewise, for people that want to get booked to be a guest on other podcasts, to make that as easy as possible for them, while also not costing them an arm and a leg. And so a lot of times these are the same people. You're a podcaster, but I'm sure you want to be a guest on other podcasts, because that's actually the number one way you can grow your own podcast audience, is to be a guest on other podcasts. And
Right.
so I said, hey, let's create a service and let's start it out. Let's make it very simple. And I modeled it after a service called Help a Reporter Out, that a lot of people in the PR and marketing business are familiar with. It's just an email-based service, and they'll send out requests. So let's say you wrote for an artist magazine, and you needed to find someone who had spent more than $10,000 on a single piece of artwork for a story you're writing about, people that I don't know if that's mid-range art buyers or something like that. So on that service, you would say, hey, here's what I'm looking for. And then all these people would respond, oh, I'm perfect. I bought this, this, and this. Or I have a client who's perfect, et cetera, et cetera. And so same thing for podcasts. Every week I send out a list of podcasts that are looking for guests and what their qualifications are. So if you want to be a guest on a show, you open this up, and let's say you're an entrepreneur, you'd scroll through the list, and there's something, for example, on one of my upcoming newsletters, there's one called Vet to Biz Life, and it's for military veterans that are now in business and entrepreneurs, and they interview people that meet those characteristics. So if you meet those characteristics, you then click a link and submit yourself, and you make that pitch that we talked about earlier, and that goes to the host of the show. And then he gets that list of all the people that are interested, says, oh, this would be a great person, sends an email, and you kind of kick it off from there. Likewise, if you're so that's if you're a guest looking to be a podcaster. If you're a podcaster looking for guests, well, you can be one of the featured newsletters in there. And also in each newsletter, I feature some guests that are looking to be experts as well. So we get kind of both sides of the equation in that newsletter. So it's very simple, and the baseline service is absolutely free. If you want to be a guest on podcasts, you can scroll through, find a podcast and submit yourself, and it's free for podcasters to be featured in that newsletter as well. In fact, have you submitted yours, Linda, to be featured in the newsletter?
Not like, if I'm thinking of your newsletter that comes out, you have the box up on the top, and then you have like 6 people that are featured.
Right. No, but
yeah.
I'm thinking about as a podcast.
No, as a podcast, no, I have not done that yet.
Yeah. So like for just to give you an example of the scale of this now, there are over 3,500 subscribers, and if we posted your podcast, so let's just use it as an example and said, hey, we're looking for entrepreneurs, business people, artists, people that can relate something to creatives.
Mm-hmm.
We'd probably get 50 plus responses in that week. So,
Cool.
A lot of people are using this service now, and it's working. I'm excited every week to see the number of connections we're making. I had one person who came to me and said they've been booked on literally over 24 podcasts in the past year using the service. So it's a much easier way to get booked as a guest on podcasts, and as a podcaster, a much easier way to find guests.
And is that just to be just ask another question on top of that, Andrew? Is that because they featured their podcast in their swaps, or are these just some of the experts that are just listed in the directory and want to be guests?
Right. Yeah, so let me kind of draw a line here. You've got 2 sides to this. You have the guests, and then you have the podcasts. And so if a podcaster is looking for guests, obviously everyone wants to be a guest on podcasts, and they get a ton of responses like that.
Right.
If you're an expert that wants to be a guest on another podcast, you're competing against all those people. And there are a couple of ways you're doing this. One is you're submitting yourself to these podcasts when they're featured, and you're making your pitch, and the better your pitch is, the more likely you'll be invited on. And then there's a flip side to that, which is an optional paid service, which is to be featured as an expert and get more exposure to these podcasters. And when you do that, you get 2 things. One, you get listed in a directory of experts that I keep on the site. And so anyone who's looking for guests can peruse that and invite you. And then if you pay a little bit more, you can be featured in a newsletter on a rotating basis. And that actually helps a lot in getting people to invite you to be a guest on their show, because you're getting in front of 3,500 plus people, and they're scrolling through and they're like, oh, this person would be great for my podcast. Let me invite them. So this particular person who's been booked over 24 times does not pay to use the service. It's free. And they've just submitted themselves and made good pitches to the podcasters and to relevant podcasts as they've used the service.
Okay. Well, that's wonderful. And I was just kind of curious too. If the podcast gets featured and they're getting, I don't know, let's just say on average 100 requests to come on their show, and a person has put in the request and hasn't heard anything back, they shouldn't take that as a negative. I mean, if they're going through 100 applications, they could be picking them off, one at a time, and who knows, a month from now you may get invited in, 2 months from now or something like that. I mean,
absolutely. Absolutely. And so now, first of all, I want to be clear, not everyone gets, 100 I don't think I've hit, but and not everyone gets 50. The entrepreneur and business related ones tend to get the most, and it depends on how specific their qualifications are. The more specific you are, and the higher the requirements, the fewer responses you'll get, but they'll be bang on, right? And so a lot of podcasts, if I have one about sports or the arts, specifically looking for artists, we might be talking 5, 10, 15 responses. So yes, one of the downsides to ones that get a lot of responses is that they're going to be pickier, or it's going to take them longer to get back to you and that sort of thing. So I do get people that email me and say, hey, I've submitted myself to a lot of podcasts and I haven't heard back. And And this is actually, it's funny that we're talking about this because I just created a brief, hey, here's what you need to do thing on my for my newsletter, for an upcoming newsletter. One is to hone that pitch. Make sure it's specific. And if you do pay it's $9 a month to have your own profile in a directory at the basic level. If you do that, you get an easy copy and paste URL to your profile that you can submit when you submit yourself to these podcasts. And that's helpful to a podcaster. They see that you're committed and they can go see your full profile and learn more about you before inviting you. But the other thing is, hey, make that pitch good and only submit it to podcasts that you're truly qualified for. It gets frustrating sometimes because people will just copy and paste it to 4 podcasts in each newsletter and it's the same pitch. Well, that's not going to work. You might get a hit here or there, but if it's the same pitch to each podcaster, then your conversion rate is going to be much lower than if you say, hey, I checked out your podcast or I understand that your audience would be interested in XYZ and I can talk about XYZ. In fact, I've talked about XYZ on these 3 podcasts, on ABC podcasts, that sort of pitch. And, oh, by the way, if I'm on your podcast, I will tweet out the episode link to my ex-followers, or I'll put it in my own stream, or I'll feature it on my blog. That sort of thing will help you get a higher, let's just call it a conversion rate of people that invite you to be on their show.
Right. Yeah. So I have being an artist on your service naturally, like you were saying, it's very entrepreneurial, very business based, which is wonderful. No issues with that. But being an artist on there, I'm not as convincing to talk business as somebody who's actually doing,
but you have a long career at P&G, right?
Right, exactly. So I could pitch that instead of pitching it more as a creative entrepreneur, as more of I can talk business in the Fortune 500 world. So.
I think it's both, though, right? I mean, yes, on entrepreneur, but on a business one, I think that you have business credibility, right? And so you can leverage that. But yes, I suppose you're right. On the entrepreneur side, you need to focus, if you're talking about entrepreneurship, on what you do entrepreneurially, right? And then the size of your following so that you can help them out.
Right. Yeah. So I guess I was just pointing that out as kind of ways to get folks to think differently about how they're going to pitch themselves to, keep in mind who you're pitching to and try to talk about what you can bring. I mean, if I would go to somebody who wants to talk stock market and I say, I'm an artist and an author, they're going to go, get out of here.
Yeah, they're not going to respond to that.
Right.
So,
but if I say I write a book that has to do with, a character who is a, Wall Street guy, and I know all about investing and different things that, or not all about it, but
or I retired and became an artist because I did so well investing in the stock market. Artistry is my second, thing. It's just my passion. Yeah. If you can find something that's related to it, that certainly can help.
Right. Yeah. So I'm going to tell everybody. The folks that will be watching this on YouTube will naturally see a little PowerPoint that I have up here that has podcastguests.com. So if you go out and Google that or just type it into the URL up at the top of your browser, and that'll take you to Andrew's site, and just have a look around that, because I think this is one of these services that is, it's just like I said, we just started it, about a year ago, right?
Yeah, it's coming up on 2 years. It'll be 2 years sometime this year. So.
And I can only see this getting bigger and bigger because it's the service is very easy to use. I do use it. I do submit to things. I have to hone my pitch. I will say that up front, because I probably have only gotten one request, and it was so far out in left field I wasn't comfortable being there. So I was like, I could do this, but I'm not so sure I'm your right guest, and so that didn't really result into anything. But at the same time, it's also teaching me how to hone my pitch to some things, and that's new for me because I'm always the one that's pitching to the guest to come on my show. So that's totally different than me pitching myself to go on somebody else's show. So, so there's some education there that has to happen. And I'm I'm trying. I'm working hard at it. So,
Yeah.
but,
Well, and as you mentioned, it might just be they haven't gotten to you yet because think about the person who does one podcast a week who suddenly gets 2 dozen people interested in being on their show.
right. That's 12
Um,
weeks.
so ideally, I love to have them reach out to people right away and say, hey, I've got a lot of responses, but I'm interested in you. But some of them are just going to keep referring back to those, and when they need you, they will reach out to you. So,
Right.
I certainly encourage you to keep trying. It might be
Oh,
that your pitches are great, but we just haven't featured the right podcast and that sort of thing to get the match for you.
right.
So.
And I'm okay with that. Don't think that was not a complaining thing. That is
No,
okay.
no, it's
Don't think of it that because it really wasn't meant
it's
that way.
fantastic. Well, and I love people to come in with realistic expectations
Right.
too. Service. Now, the great thing is you go to podcastguest.com, you sign up, and it's free. You don't have to pay anything. If you want to, you can pay the $9 a month or $29 a month, depending on which option you choose. If you want to get potentially more exposure, and the way I look at that too is, how much is getting booked to be a guest on another podcast worth to you? And
Right.
and I tell people this that have a podcast or are trying to build their brand, it's probably worth a lot, right? So
Mhm.
so even if once a quarter, the right opportunity lands in your lap, I think that's a great value for both your time and or money if you choose to go that way. So
Yeah.
um, you know
Where I,
that's the way I look at it anyway.
yeah, where I see the gem of this, of your service, of podcastguests.com is this. I can spend a lot of time Googling podcasts that may or may not hit my search criteria that I put in there. Okay, so I can spend a couple hours each day going through the millions of podcasts that are out there trying to find one that I can pitch myself to via an email and never hear anything back from, because believe me, folks,
Mm,
I have done that. Okay, and it certainly didn't feel like it was worth the time to do that because I never received an answer back. I
hmm.
mean, not even a rejection answer back. It's like, no, I
Right,
don't think there's a fit,
right.
So,
Yep.
or else I would notice that the ones that I have found haven't recorded a show in 3 years.
Yeah,
So there's
yeah.
no sense of
That's
pitching something to them, right? So,
you'd be surprised. Well, you wouldn't be, but yeah, there are a lot that you come across that just aren't publishing anymore.
yeah, so the gem of this service and why I think and why I'm bringing it to everybody and why I think this is going to be a great thing and it's just going to continue to grow is all of that time that I spent searching for those podcasts. I now have a service where I can go to, and I am one of the
Hmm.
$29 month a month subscribers, I think.
Hmm.
And I'll let you talk about those two different levels here in a second. But I get an email from Andrew every week that highlights guests and shows, and then I have the opportunity to, at that point, send my pitch in, either to have them on my show or to do a show, try to become a
Hmm.
guest on a show. And that time that I spent searching for podcasts to be on has now, and guests have now been reduced a lot. I mean, what, 5 minutes looking over the email. If I respond, that may be another 10, 15, 20, 25 minutes, depending on how how creative I want to be. and then
Right,
and
right.
and then all of a sudden I send that in, and then I just kind of like sit back and wait and see what happens, because I've actually done some active work in trying to get on other people's show or having them on my show.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
so and that's where I think I see the gem. So hang in there, Andrew, because I can see this getting bigger. And like I said,
Yeah.
it's one of the things why I wanted you on the show was because I know there's going to be people out there, artists and other people out there that are going to say, well, I can offer myself up as an expert. I can talk about the art process. I'm going to
Sure.
go, I'm going to go over and
Absolutely.
get in here, and then they're going to find me. And so that helps with that whole cycle of trying to get yourself out there.
Yeah, yeah, and it's great to see particular segments of let's call it niches, let's call it categories grow. I mean,
Hmm.
entrepreneurs were the low-hanging fruit, plenty of those, but then a lot of people in the financial world, financial services world started joining. There are a couple that I'm trying to grow that are a little bit more challenging than others. Sports, surprisingly,
Ah,
it's one of those things where I have a lot of people looking for guests for their wrestling podcast. And I don't know why that's a niche in there, but then, other than that in the sports, it can be a little bit difficult when I feature one that's, a football podcast or something like that. So,
But if you have a
but it's
bunch,
fun.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I was say, if you have a lot of artists signing up after this, I get a cut, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Let's yes, I'll tell you what too, if you have a podcast and you're listening to this, after and you want your podcast to be featured to find guests, after you do that, send me an email and say, hey, I heard about you on Linda's podcast, and I'll move you up the queue. We have a little bit of a queue of podcasts that want to be featured. So if you're listening to this and you're into that, and you have your own podcast, let me help you out. And the same goes for you, Linda. If you want to have your podcast featured, happy to move you up the list.
Absolutely. So I'd love to. And I'll send you an email separate on that, and we can talk about that offline.
Sure, absolutely. So, so being in this directory, as you mentioned, Linda, there are two levels here. One is at $9, and that basically gives you an online profile. And oftentimes, if you pitch yourself to be a guest on podcasts, the podcaster might say, hey, send me your one sheet. And you might scratch your head and say, well, what's a one sheet? Well, it's exactly that. It's one sheet, it's one page that is kind of like a sales pitch for you. And all the things we talked about earlier that, are part of your pitch are part of that page. So for example, if we pull yours up on podcastguest.com, so it's podcastguest.com/LFISLER, you'll see your background information, topics you can discuss, 10 interview questions that the person can ask you, links to previous podcasts and media experiences, your social media profile, and how you'll help promote podcasts you're on. So even if you're just reaching out to someone the old manual way, like you discussed, Linda, looking up a podcast and reaching out to them, you need to send them that sort of information in an easy to digest format. And so the old way of doing this in the industry is people send a PDF of this one sheet. Well, I don't know about you, but I surf the internet a lot on my phone. And, if you're looking up a restaurant's menu and it's in a PDF, that's not a good experience. The same thing goes for this. So that's one of the reasons I created the online kind of call them one sheets or profile pages, where you can just send a link to someone. It's mobile friendly, it's SEO friendly, and people can find they can find out more about you and invite you on their show. And so, excuse me, talking a lot here.
Yeah,
so,
sorry, no problem. I'm trying to actually get the screen to show show podcast.com. I'm not being successful.
You're going to podcastguests.com?
Yeah, no, I'm not. I'm successfully there. I'm having a problem sharing it to the group. So
sure. So for $9 a month, you get that. Here's your profile page, and you're in the directory. So if someone comes along looking for your expertise, they will put it in there. Okay, so here's Linda's profile right here, and you can see the URL up at your top. And if someone's reading this profile and they say, hey, I want Linda to be a guest on my podcast, they just click that orange button and they fill out a form, or they can click invite up at the top. And so Linda's getting a number of benefits from this. First of all, she can get booked to be a guest on podcasts, but there's also, this is linking to her social profile, websites, that sort of thing as well. So there's some benefit to you from that as well, just being on there. And so in this profile you're looking at, so Linda has paid a little bit more, $29 a month, to not only get an expanded profile here with more links and multiple categories, but she's also being featured in the newsletter on a rotating basis and getting in front of more people. I also post the featured experts to my social channels, which are Twitter. On Twitter, it's at Podcast Guests, and on Facebook, it's facebook.com/Podcast Guests. So that helps as well, getting more exposure. And people say, well, how many times will I be invited if I pay for that extra amount? It depends. I have people that have been invited 10 times in the first month or two, and then some people that haven't received any invitations yet. And it's a matter of which category you're in, and also how you're pitching yourself. So as I look through this, I should have done this before the show. There, a couple small tweaks that I'm going to suggest to Linda after the show that I think will make it kind of stand out to people more as they just scan through the list or see her in the newsletter.
That'd be great. I would appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll
we're all learning, this isn't.
Yeah.
So cool.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and so there's two options there. I invite everyone to start at the free level. Just go sign up. You won't have a profile for yourself, but you can see how it works. And then if it's a fit for you, then you can sign up and do the paid level. And try it out. And it's month to month. If it doesn't work for you, no hard feelings. Just let me know your feedback, and you can cancel. But for most people, it's working. It's not a flood of people, based on their profile, but it's working well. Yeah. And as you see here, Linda, if you're watching this, Linda has the screen up. All you need to give me is your name and your email, and then you're signed up. So and you'll be signed up immediately. The newsletter goes out every Monday. Unless it's a major holiday. So at 10 a.m. my time, I'm in Austin, so Central Time, and it's fun because instantly people start submitting themselves to podcasts and inviting people. So it's kind of fun. I press the send button, it goes out to 3,500 plus people, and then people start matching. So it's fun.
Yeah, one thing that I guess it sounds like we're going to have a couple conversations after this, Andrew, which is great. Like I said, I appreciate that. And one of the things, like I said, is arts. I had myself under arts. I took myself out of arts because, you only have one. Like you said, you have a lot more under
that
entrepreneur. Yeah, and finance. And like you said, we're just starting this. So that's one of the reasons why I would get you out in front of my art folks so that they know that this is out here and we can grow this business together. The other thing that I'm an author and a writer, and that's the other, maybe we can get a directory going for that as well.
Oh, right.
And I can tell you about some of the things that I'm going to be doing in that area to get more authors and writers and hopefully readers to start listening to the podcast. So more than happy to work with you on doing that
Excellent.
as well.
That would be great. And this is one of those things. I'm not an artist, so I need to understand more about it, right?
Yeah. Well, like I said, I'm an artist and a business person, so I'd be more than happy to work with you to get, to kind of be an on point person to help you in that area. Any way you want to do it, we can have that conversation off of here. But I wanted to make that offer to you up front as well. So, so this is what it looks like. Very clean, very easy to use. You click on a directory that you want to find a guest for, or different things like that. I mean, there's travel, there's a whole bunch of things here that, and these grew. I mean, I'm talking these grew in the last, 4 months, because I don't remember.
So the directory has only been online since the middle of November, right? So the service has been online now for almost 100 weeks, so close to 2 years, but the directory is just since November. And so in a little tip to people as well, right now the directory is on a first in basis. So whomever signed up first shows up at the top whenever someone's in a category and that sort of thing. And then whoever signed up, later on is down. So the sooner you signed up, the better. So
Right. And there's Andrew.
There's me. I was first.
I wonder why.
My web developer, she actually just removed herself from it, but she was actually number one for a while.
Okay.
Because she helped build it. So
yeah, since we're out on the website real quick here, I clicked on Get Listed. Now this is not the free service. Okay, the free service was over here on Home. And that's where you just log up to basically get your newsletter that has all of the different features that you're offering. Then to get listed, we have these two services, which is the basic and the premium. So why don't you go through this real quick, since we're kind of doing a little introduction to your site. We might as well cover the important thing. So,
right. So the basic package for $9 a month. So you get that one sheet, as I discussed, or one pager. You're going to be in the directory. That's a mobile-friendly profile. You're also going to have a simple URL that you can use to, frankly, I put it in my email signature and say, hey, book me to be on your podcast, click here, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then you've got that URL that's your sales pitch. And then podcasters can contact you directly through the site. And I've got a bit of a spam filter on there too. So hopefully, in fact, they all kind of go through me at this point. When you submit, when someone submits that, you'll only get clean, kind of good invitations. You'll be listed in one category, and that profile will be in the expert directory, which I realized is on there twice. But that's important, so it's good it's on there twice. And then at the premium level, you get all of that stuff. Plus, you can link up to 3 different websites that you have.
Mm-hmm.
And there's some value in there if you're in the SEO and that sort of thing as well. Listed in 2 categories, which, for someone like Linda, that's very beneficial. Your profile is also featured above all the non-premium profiles whenever someone clicks on a category or goes to the directory. And then on a rotating basis, you're featured in that newsletter that's sent to over 3,000 people. And although it doesn't say it on there, I also promote you on social media like Facebook and Twitter as well.
Right. So there we go. So that's, again, a good thing to look at, podcastguests.com. So I think we're getting pretty close. Let me get back and figure out how to share my PowerPoint again.
Okay.
This is a little experiment. I've been doing this. Yeah. So basically, we are at the point where we can talk about advice, and I think we kind of hit some of that as we went along. But I guess if I could say to you, like, what's your 2 best bullet point advice for podcasters and or guests, maybe 2 apiece or 1 for each one. What is that?
Yeah, so I would say for guests, and I guess I alluded to this a little bit earlier, is be prepared. So we've talked a lot about making the right pitch and that sort of thing, but when you go on a show, understand what they're looking for, and so you can deliver that value. You don't want to make it all about your service,
Mm-hmm.
that sort of thing. You want to actually give them some good, heartfelt advice and be prepared. As a podcaster, man, this is going to sound kind of trite, but just get out there and start it and stick to it. I mean, try different things. And if you're the type of person who's going to give up after 5 or 10 weeks, being either a podcaster or a guest on podcast probably isn't for you. But if you play the long game on this, I think it can be extremely beneficial to you both professionally and personally.
Yeah. I never thought when I started podcasting, I started it with I was working with an internationally known artist by the name of Kevin McPherson, and we had a website called Artist Mentors Online. We no longer do that because we both have gone in different ways, and there was a lot of work behind keeping a content-driven website up to date and have something new every week. And it was way too much work considering where we went in our careers. And but it was a fun experience for the 3 years that we had it. And part of that came out of that. I talked with Kevin at one point and said, instead of me sitting here writing a blog that comes out every day, why don't we do a podcast that I can do once a week and we'll reach more people? And he was a little, he kind of stepped back and was just kind of like, well, I don't know, I don't want to do that. And I'm like, well, you don't have to, I'll do it. And he's like, okay. And that's how it started 3 years ago.
Right.
That's how it started. And, I had backed it down. I was doing it once a week. Then I backed it down to once a month because I just got so busy. And then I had basically a personal tragedy, not tragedy. It worked out fine. I shouldn't use that word. Bad word for a writer. But,
Right.
a personal, my husband was in a pedal bike accident.
Oh,
and
no.
there was just no way that I could concentrate on getting guests and giving, attention to that, as well as keeping other things up in the air at the time. He's 100% better now, and I'm getting back into doing the podcasting again because I've seen the power of having a podcast out there. And at one point, I even just started, just so my audience would hear my voice and know me, I was doing what I was calling blog casting, where I just log on to my little go-to meeting and create a few little slides and said, this is what I've been working on. And I just wanted to let you know that I'm still back here working on book 4. It's called Cloaked. I'm not going to do a cover reveal because, I haven't created one yet. Those kind of things, just that people,
Right.
so that people heard me and knew I was out there. And, I explained to them what happened to my husband. And, so a lot of the conversation that happened after that was really sweet and endearing and supportive. And, it's just, you just don't think that you're that big in somebody else's life, but it's just the fact that they get to hear your voice and
Yeah.
know that you're human, and things happen to you as well as them. And it was just real comforting, I think, through that whole
Yeah.
time to know that
Yeah.
that was going on. And
Good.
so
There's another benefit. There's another benefit.
exactly, it's like you may not know who they are for like in person, but I guarantee you, I mean, I ran into a couple people who have seen my photograph, and like I'd be out at a store or in a restaurant or the airport or
Hmm.
whatever. And it always
Yeah.
happens to be when I'm not looking my best. So,
Sure, of course.
and it was, it's like, oh, I listened to you. One of my favorite stories is one of my artist friends that I interviewed on the show told me that her friend was walking around a grocery store listening to my podcast on her phone. Now, she didn't have her phone up to her ear. She kind of had it, I guess, like on speakerphone, where she goes, the next thing she noticed, she turned around and there were 7 people following her listening
Yeah.
to the podcast. It was just the funniest image that I had in my head
Oh,
with
that's
that.
funny.
So you
That's
just don't
funny.
know that it's a really easy medium to get into, but you just don't know how many people you're touching.
Hmm.
But
Hmm.
so don't make like your friend that said, he was only getting 100 people to listen, and when he was getting real discouraged, don't get discouraged. You may need to take a break or something, and that's okay. But and tell them that you're going to take a break. Tell the people you're going to take a break, because that's what I did. And then I just started to get back into it a little bit at a time, just doing the what I call the blog casts. And then I said, well, no, I want to talk with other people, because these are, it's getting harder and harder just to log on for 10 or 15 minutes and talk about what I'm doing. It doesn't sound exciting to me. So it's much more
Right.
exciting to have somebody else talk about what they're doing, I guess is the way I look at it.
Hmm.
So,
Hmm.
but
Hmm.
yeah, so Andrew, I think that was it as far as the questions that we were going to ask you. Anything else you
Excellent.
want? Yeah, anything else you want to add?
No, Linda, I really appreciate you inviting me to come onto your show.
Yeah, I appreciate you being here. Like I said, we'll talk offline and talk about maybe trying to reach out to some art folks and
Yeah,
build that part of it, because I really do think this is a great service. And we're going to hang in there and see where it goes and where we can take it. Maybe we'll have some conversations
excellent.
offline. So
Excellent.
yeah, so on the next shows, I know I've been promising this, guys, for a while. And hang with me. Stefan and Gabrielle from Skyboat Media, my audiobook is in post production right now. So, Blind Influence, which is the first book in the series, will be coming out. I believe the launch date is April 3rd. Like it says, in post production. And Stefan and Gabrielle are going to come on the show. They're the two that Gabrielle directed. Stefan read with Gabrielle on the book, and they're going to come on the show and they're going to give us their insight to the book. And basically, we're going to talk probably visual storytelling again, and all kind of neat stuff like that. So that's a show that's coming up. I believe that'll probably be coming up in maybe mid-March timeframe. And I have a special contest that we're going to be running, and I'm going to announce it on that show. And if I can't get Gabrielle and Stefan to be on that show when I want to make the announcement, listen to the show, because I am going to put something out there about it. It's a way that you can win one of my a canvas print of one of my paintings. So that'll be coming up in mid-March. George Gallo, fellow artist, friend, director, screenwriter, producer out in Hollywood, very good friend of mine. He's going to be coming on the show as soon as he gets out of post-production of Bigger, which is his newest movie out there that he is directing. And we're going to talk painting. We're going to talk about Bigger. We're going to talk about the David LaFell movie that he pulled together as well, which is an artist that everybody out on my artist side knows about. Also going to have Michael Harding back on the show, and we're going to talk about his new paint creations. And I believe he might even be able to talk about a new line of products that he has coming out at that time too. So for now, thank you, Andrew, again for being on and hanging in with us. I appreciate you coming
My
on the
pleasure.
show. Yeah, so everybody hang in there, have a good time, and we'll catch you next time on All Things Creative.